Sure is a shame me and you having to face it out this way.
You could have stayed behind a rock.
I never could enjoy spending this $20,000 I done you that way, Sheriff.
Randolph Scott was the picture of the lone cowboy. Tall, rugged, and stoic, he rode into the sunset more times than any actor of Hollywood's golden age. On screen, he was the eternal bachelor of the frontier, a man without ties, without family, without fear. But in real life, the story was very different. Off-screen, Randolph Scott was not a solitary drifter at all. He was a devoted husband and a proud father of 2 children. While Hollywood celebrated him as one of its greatest Western stars, he built a private life defined not by fame, but by family. So today we're asking, whatever happened to Randolph Scott's kids? Randolph Scott was born George Randolph Scott on January 23, 1898, in Charlotte, North Carolina. He grew up in a large Southern family, the second of 7 children. His father, George Grant Scott, worked as a textile executive, and his mother, Lucy Crane Scott, was devoted to raising their children with discipline, faith, and good manners. Their household was strict but nurturing, instilling values that Randolph would carry with him throughout his life. From an early age, Randolph showed a love for sports and the outdoors. He was tall, athletic, and competitive, excelling at football and track. He also learned to ride horses, a skill that would one day serve him well on screen. Neighbors remembered him as polite, serious, and a little reserved. That quiet nature became a defining part of his later screen presence. At the time, however, Hollywood was the furthest thing from his mind. "When I was growing up, I never dreamed of Hollywood," he later said. "I thought my life would be business, not show business." His ambition was practical. He wanted a stable career and a solid future. After finishing high school, Scott enrolled at Georgia Tech in Atlanta to study engineering, following the steady professional path expected of him. Later, he transferred to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he continued in the same field. But like so many young men of his generation, his studies were cut short by World War I. Randolph enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1917 and served with an artillery unit in France. The war hardened him, but also gave him perspective. "I learned about discipline, patience, and doing your duty," he recalled. "Those are lessons you don't forget." When the war ended and he returned home, he seemed destined for a quiet life, perhaps in the family business. Yet fate intervened. Through a family friend in California, Scott was introduced to the world of film. And if you are into classic Hollywood icons, amazing stories, and newly discovered insights, then hit that subscribe button. We are on our way to 10,000 subscribers, and your support will mean a lot to our channel. At first, he thought little of it. Acting, to him, was just another job, a way to make ends meet during the uncertain years of the late 1920s. But his tall frame, rugged good looks, and quiet charm made him stand out. He began landing small roles and soon found himself pulled deeper into the industry. Looking back later in life, Scott admitted, "I never set out to be a star. I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time." That luck and his unmistakable screen presence would soon turn him from an ordinary young man from North Carolina into one of the most enduring Western icons of all time. By the early 1930s, Randolph Scott was carving out a place for himself in Hollywood. At first, he appeared in small roles, often as an extra or in the background of big studio pictures. But his tall frame, rugged good looks, and natural ease on horseback soon made him a perfect fit for the westerns that were becoming one of Hollywood's most popular genres. His earliest breaks came through his connection to director Cecil B. DeMille, where he appeared in films such as The Ten Commandments and The King of Kings. These were small roles, but they placed him in the company of major directors and stars and gave him the chance to learn the craft by watching and listening. "I didn't know a thing about acting when I started," Scott later admitted. I just tried to be natural and honest in front of the camera. By the mid-1930s, Scott's career was gaining momentum. He acted alongside some of the biggest stars of the era, including Mae West, Shirley Temple, and Irene Dunne, and proved himself versatile, able to handle both adventure films and romantic leads. Still, it was the Western that became his true home. Unlike the brash cowboys of early Hollywood, Scott brought a quiet dignity and moral clarity to his characters. He once explained his style by saying, "I don't act, I react. That's what a cowboy is supposed to do." Throughout the 1940s, Scott was one of the top box office draws in America. He headlined major studio westerns including Virginia City, Western Union, and Colt 45, consistently portraying men of principle, strong but restrained, and always grounded in decency. In 1949, he was ranked among the top 10 money-making stars in the motion picture Herald poll, a measure of just how beloved he was with audiences. In the 1950s, as television began to challenge cinema, Scott chose to focus on a new kind of Western. He joined forces with director Bud Botisher and screenwriter Burt Kennedy to create a cycle of lean, morally complex Westerns often called the Renown cycle, including 7 Men from Now, The Tall T, Ride Lonesome, and Comanche Station. Critics hailed these films as some of the finest ever made in the genre, praising their simplicity and Scott's quietly commanding presence. Film historian Jim Kitses said, "Randolph Scott embodied the Western hero in its purest form. He carried the weight of justice in his stance and his silence." Scott's final role came in 1962 in Ride the High Country, directed by Sam Peckinpah. The film paired him with fellow legend Joel McCrea and was seen as a fitting farewell to both of their careers. The National Board of Review honored the film as one of the 10 best of the year, and later the Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry as a work of cultural and historical significance. When asked why he retired after that film, Scott answered simply, "I had said everything I had to say as an actor. It was time to go home." By the time he stepped away from the screen, Randolph Scott had appeared in more than 100 films, more than 60 of them Westerns. He was celebrated not only by audiences, but also by critics and filmmakers who admired his consistency and authenticity. In 1975, the Western Heritage Museum awarded him a Bronze Wrangler for his contribution to the genre, and in 1997, he was posthumously inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. His star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame at 6243. Hollywood Boulevard stands as a permanent reminder of his place in film history. Randolph Scott had become, in the words of Bud Botisher, the cowboy America believed in. Away from the cameras, Randolph Scott lived a life that contrasted sharply with the rugged lone cowboys he portrayed on screen. In reality, he was a man who valued privacy, stability, and above all, family. Scott's first marriage was to heiress Marion DuPont in 1936, but the union was short-lived and the couple divorced after just 3 years. He found lasting love in 1944 when he married Patricia Stillman, a woman of grace and discretion who would remain by his side for more than 4 decades, until his death in 1987. Friends often remarked on their quiet devotion to one another. Patricia preferred to stay far from Hollywood's spotlight, which suited Randolph perfectly. "My work was for the public," he once explained, "but my home was for my family." The couple longed for children, and in 1950 they adopted 2, a son named Christopher and a daughter named Sandra. For Scott, fatherhood was a deeply personal joy. Colleagues remembered him leaving the studio promptly after filming to spend evenings at home, dining with Patricia and reading stories to his children. He believed in giving them the stable, private upbringing that his own public life could not offer. "Fame is mine, not theirs," he insisted. "My children deserve to live normal lives." Christopher and Sandra grew up in Beverly Hills but were shielded carefully from the excesses of Hollywood. Their education was prioritized, and Randolph encouraged them to pursue their own dreams away from acting. Those who knew the family recalled Scott as a disciplined but fair father, teaching his children respect, honesty, and self-reliance, the same qualities that defined his characters on screen. Unlike many children of stars, Christopher and Sandra did not chase the spotlight. Both lived private lives, largely outside of the public record. Sandra was remembered as warm, kind, and family-oriented, while Christopher pursued business interests and avoided media attention. Neither spoke often about their father, but that silence itself reflected his values: privacy, modesty, and dignity. Randolph Scott never flaunted his family life. Instead, he carried it quietly, a source of strength that grounded him even as he rode across the silver screen as Hollywood's most stoic cowboy. "Everything I achieved in film," he said once, "meant little compared to the love I had at home." Randolph Scott's two children, Christopher and Sandra, entered his life at the height of his career, when he and Patricia Stillman longed for a family of their own. They did not arrive through Hollywood headlines or dramatic announcements, but through adoption, a choice that reflected Randolph and Patricia's commitment to building a private, grounded home life. Christopher Scott was born in 1945 and adopted as an infant by Randolph and Patricia 5 years later in 1950. From his earliest years, he carried the same quiet seriousness that his father displayed on screen. Teachers described him as intelligent, reserved, and drawn to mathematics and the sciences. His father often told him, "A man's education is the one thing that can never be taken away," and Christopher lived by that lesson. Unlike many children of stars, Christopher was not raised around cameras or premieres. Instead, he spent weekends fishing, riding horses, and working in the garden with his father. These were not glamorous activities, but they were the moments where Randolph instilled the values he believed mattered most: humility, self-reliance, and decency. As Christopher grew older, he followed a path far from Hollywood. Accounts suggest he built a career in business and even pursued philanthropic efforts. Friends remembered him as dependable and modest, a man who rarely invoked his father's name. In private, however, he was deeply proud of the example Randolph set. "Dad gave the world his films," he once confided to a friend. "But what he gave me was much more important: the example of how to live with honor." Sandra Scott was born in 1950. The same year, she was adopted by Randolph and Patricia. As the younger child, she inherited her mother's warmth and grace, but also shared her father's quiet strength. From an early age, she loved reading and art, often filling sketchbooks with drawings or disappearing into novels. Randolph supported her creativity, encouraging her with the words, "Your gifts don't need an audience to be real. What matters is that you use them honestly." Some reports refer to Sandra as Rebecca and suggest she later developed her artistic talents into a career, with works shown in exhibitions. Regardless of the name recorded, what is certain is that she chose a path away from Hollywood. Friends and family remembered her as thoughtful, kind, and deeply grounded, a woman who valued family and personal passions over public recognition. Both Christopher and Sandra were raised in Beverly Hills, but their home was far from the glitz of Hollywood. Randolph and Patricia carefully shielded them from the spotlight, insisting on good manners, privacy, and discipline. Family dinners were times of conversation and laughter, with lessons about respect woven into the smallest details. "Fame is mine, not theirs," Randolph said more than once. "My children deserve the chance to live normal lives." In adulthood, Christopher pursued a quiet life in business and philanthropy, while Sandra nurtured her love for creativity and family. Neither sought the spotlight, and both respected their father's wish for privacy. In that silence, they honored his legacy more than any public tribute ever could. Years later, Christopher shared his perspective in a book whose very title sounds like a song. Whatever Happened to Randolph Scott? Published in 1994 with film historian William C. Klein, the title echoed the Statler brothers' hit of the same name. But the book wasn't a Hollywood tell-all. Instead, it was a son's reminiscences of what it was like to grow up with Randolph Scott as a father. According to Chris, his dad was always the consummately caring and loving father, and above all, a deeply religious man. He described Randolph as a devoted Episcopalian who lived his faith daily. The honesty and integrity Scott projected on screen were the same qualities he lived by at home. Christopher recalls camping trips, golf games, and lessons in patience and always doing your best. One reviewer summed it up: Scott's honesty and integrity that came through on the screen applied to his real life as well. The lessons the author learned from his father were valuable, and he is much more appreciative of them now as an adult. He admitted he was protecting his family's privacy, but what emerges is the portrait of a man devoted to his wife and children. Chris also used the book to firmly deny long-standing rumors about his father's personal life, calling them unfounded gossip. Faith was central to Randolph Scott's later years. He was a member of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he was buried. His son remembered him as deeply religious. In retirement, his circle included actor Fred Astaire and evangelist Reverend Billy Graham. Scott was also a York Rite Freemason, reflecting his lifelong connection to tradition and service. Sandra, his daughter, defended her father just as strongly. In 1989, only 2 years after Randolph's death, she wrote to the Los Angeles Times in response to an article she called misleading. Sandra condemned the book behind it as false allegations, rumors, and contorted interviews, even comparing it to a hardbound copy of the National Enquirer. Signed as Sandra Scott Tyler of Santa Barbara, the letter showed how determined she was to protect her father's reputation. She carried that work forward. In 2007, she donated her father's papers to UCLA, ensuring his history would be preserved for researchers. And in 2014, she appeared at the Lone Pine Film Festival after a screening of Comanche Station, speaking warmly of her father in the same landscapes where he had filmed so many westerns. Christopher, by contrast, lived more quietly. When Patricia passed away in 2004, her obituary noted that Christopher was married to his wife, Vicky, and had children of his own, making Randolph Scott a grandfather before his death in 1987. Some reports, including one from writer David Aaron Moore, suggest that Chris has lived on a barrier island off the coast of North Carolina, far from Hollywood's spotlight. According to Chris, his father's humility lasted until the end. Randolph Scott wore a hearing aid in his later years, a detail Chris mentioned in his book, a quiet reminder that even legends face the same frailties as everyone else. Randolph Scott made over 100 films and became the cowboy America believed in. But at home, he was a father who wanted nothing more than to raise his children with love and integrity. Everything I achieved in film, he said, meant little compared to the love I had at home. Christopher and Sandra carried that love into their own lives, and in doing so, they became the truest reflection of the values their father lived by: privacy, humility, and quiet strength. As Randolph Scott moved into the later years of his life, he turned his back on Hollywood's spotlight with the same quiet resolve that had defined his career. After completing his final film, Ride the High Country, in 1962, he chose to retire completely from acting. When asked why, he answered simply, "I had said everything I had to say as an actor." It was time to go home. Home for Randolph was never about premieres or publicity. It was about Patricia, the woman he had married in 1944, and the family they had built together. The couple had longed for children of their own, but when they were unable to conceive, they made the heartfelt decision to adopt. In 1950, they welcomed Christopher and Sandra into their lives. For Scott, adoption was not second best. It was the fulfillment of his deepest wish. He told friends, "It doesn't matter how a child comes to you. What matters is the love you give, and the love they give back." With his career behind him, Scott dedicated himself to this private life. The family settled first in Beverly Hills, and later on a quiet estate where he could enjoy golf, gardening, and the peace of ordinary days. Though he had once been one of the top box office stars in America, he never acted the part of a celebrity. "I never thought of myself as a star," he told a journalist in the 1970s. "I was just a working actor fortunate enough to make a living doing something I enjoyed." Scott also proved to be a shrewd businessman. Through careful investments in oil and real estate, he amassed a fortune that provided lasting security for Patricia and their children. It was this financial stability that allowed him to retire gracefully, focusing on family without the demands of Hollywood. Even in retirement, his fans did not forget him. Letters arrived daily, and Western film conventions often begged him to appear. He rarely accepted, preferring the privacy of home, but those who met him in his later years described him as courteous and modest. He carried himself with the same quiet honor off-screen that he did on it, one admirer said. On March 2, 1987, Randolph Scott passed away peacefully at the age of 89 in Beverly Hills. His death marked the end of an era. Critics and fans alike remembered him as one of the last great cowboys of Hollywood's golden age, a man who embodied dignity, decency, and strength. He was laid to rest at Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, returning home to the city where his journey had begun almost 9 decades earlier. For Christopher and Sandra, the loss was not the loss of a Hollywood legend, but of the father who had shaped their lives. Christopher once reflected, "The world saw a cowboy, but we just saw Dad." Sandra, who carried her father's same quiet strength, remembered his lessons about humility and integrity. He taught us how to live, not by what he said, but by what he did. Today, Randolph Scott's legacy endures not only in the 100 films that still play on screens, but in the values his children carried forward. Christopher and Sandra honored his greatest wish, that they live lives of dignity, independence, and privacy. In choosing adoption, Randolph and Patricia built a family defined not by blood, but by love. And in that family, Scott found his greatest role, not the cowboy America believed in, but the father his children would always remember. Randolph Scott's story is one of contrasts. On screen, he was the stoic cowboy who embodied honor, justice, and strength. Off-screen, he was a private man who found his greatest role not in Hollywood, but at home, as a husband and as a father. By choosing adoption, he and Patricia Stillman built the family they longed for, raising Christopher and Sandra with the values of dignity, humility, and independence. Scott once said, "Everything I achieved in film meant little compared to the love I had at home." Today, his legacy endures not just in the westerns that defined an era, but in the quiet lives of his children, who honored his wish for privacy and carried forward the lessons he lived by. If you enjoyed this look into Randolph Scott and his family, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss more stories about the families behind Hollywood's greatest legends. And tell us in the comments which Randolph Scott Western is your favorite.